That morning began like so many others in American history, quietly, without ceremony, without headlines, without anyone realizing that decades later, historians would still argue about what truly happened. There were no explosions, no declarations of war, no famous speech echoing across marble steps, just a narrow street in lower Manhattan, damp from the night before, and a government clerk who almost overslept. His name was Elias Whitmore. You won't find him in most textbooks. He wasn't a president, a general, or an industrial tycoon. He never commanded troops or built railroads. He never signed a document that school children memorize. But on a gray Tuesday in 1873, Elias Whitmore carried a leather folder from one office to another, and in doing so, quietly altered the economic future of the United States. To understand why that mattered, we need to step into America as it truly was then. The Civil War had ended less than a decade earlier. The nation was technically reunited, but the wounds were raw. Railroads were expanding westward at astonishing speed. Steel production was rising. Factories were multiplying. Fortunes were being made overnight. It was the age of speculation, of confidence so bold it bordered on recklessness. America believed it was unstoppable. Railroad companies borrowed enormous sums of money to lay tracks across territories that barely had towns. Investors in New York and Boston poured capital into ventures they had never seen. Banks extended credit freely, convinced that growth would never slow. But growth built on optimism can hide cracks. Elias Whitmore worked in the office of the Comptroller of the Currency. His job was not glamorous. He reviewed correspondence between regional banks and federal regulators. He logged numbers. He checked signatures. He organized reports no one expected him to read carefully. And yet, he did. In early September 1873, a stack of reports arrived from banking institutions tied to railroad financing. On the surface, the numbers looked healthy. Loans were active, construction projects were ongoing, bonds were being issued confidently. But something bothered him. The same assets seemed to appear multiple times, listed differently, described creatively, but essentially representing the same underlying collateral. Land not yet developed, tracks not yet laid, revenue not yet earned. Speculation layered upon speculation. Elias began quietly making notes in the internal documents, nothing dramatic, just small observations. Duplicated projection? Revenue estimate unrealistic? Bond maturity conflict? At the same time, across the Atlantic, financial tremors were beginning in Europe. American railroads had been heavily financed by European investors, especially in Germany. When economic pressures tightened overseas, confidence wavered. Confidence is fragile. On September 18, 1873, one of the most powerful banking houses in America, Jay Cooke Company, collapsed. The firm had been deeply invested in railroad expansion. When investors lost faith, liquidity evaporated. Panic spread almost instantly. Banks began closing their doors. The New York Stock Exchange suspended trading for 10 days, an extraordinary move. Businesses failed. Rail construction halted. Unemployment surged. This became known as the Panic of 1873. But here is where the story becomes both strange and revealing. 2 days before Jay Cooke Company collapsed publicly, Elias Whitmore's supervisor received an internal memorandum, the one Elias had annotated. It recommended further review of railroad-backed securities and suggested exposure risks were higher than officially acknowledged. The memorandum did not stop the panic, but it did something else. It triggered a small internal audit that quietly limited additional federal exposure to failing railroad bonds. A decision made without press conferences, without public drama, prevented millions more in federal losses during the collapse. No headline announced it. No statue commemorated it. Yet in the years that followed, when Congress debated banking reform, internal documents referenced prior warning signals observed in 1873. Those signals were Elias's notes. The panic of 1873 did not end quickly. The depression that followed lasted several years. Factories closed, strikes erupted, economic hardship spread across cities and rural communities alike. And this is where American history reveals its pattern. Crisis leads to reform. The economic collapse intensified debates over currency policy, greenbacks versus gold. It fueled political realignments. It reshaped trust in banks. It changed how Americans thought about risk. But history rarely remembers the clerks. Elias Whitmore never became wealthy. He remained in government service. His salary increased modestly over time. He married, had 2 children, and kept meticulous records of household expenses in small leather-bound notebooks. Yet his habit of reading closely, of questioning projections, of noticing duplication, reflected something deeply American: skepticism. Not the loud skepticism of protest, but the quiet skepticism of documentation. By the 1890s, the United States was again booming. Industrialization accelerated. Skyscrapers began to reshape city skylines. Electricity spread. Immigration surged. The frontier officially closed in 1890, according to the Census Bureau. But the lessons of 1873 lingered in regulatory frameworks. When the Panic of 1893 struck, another severe economic depression, lawmakers again examined banking oversight. Records from the 1870s were reopened. Internal procedures were compared. Warnings previously overlooked were reconsidered. History does not move in straight lines. It loops. And so we arrive at something unexpected. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law, creating the central banking system of the United States. Its purpose was to provide stability, to reduce the severity of panics like those of 1873 and 1893. In congressional archives, among thousands of pages of debate and testimony, references appear to earlier departmental memoranda identifying systemic duplication of leveraged assets. Those memoranda traced back to the 1870s. To Elias, he never knew. He died in 1911, 2 years before the Federal Reserve Act passed. There was no obituary noting his influence. No journalist connected his careful annotations to structural reform. But institutional memory is powerful. It accumulates quietly. What makes this story remarkable is not that one man prevented catastrophe. He did not. The panic happened. The depression unfolded. What makes it remarkable is that American institutions evolved partly because someone paid attention when no one expected him to. The United States has often celebrated its boldest figures, the inventors, generals, entrepreneurs, presidents, and rightly so. But behind each sweeping change lies a layer of unseen work. Paperwork, calculations, annotations and margins. The boring parts of history are often the most important. Consider this: modern financial regulations, stress testing, reporting standards, and auditing requirements all depend on the assumption that someone somewhere will read carefully, that someone will question optimistic projections, that someone will compare numbers across documents and ask, does this truly add up? That culture did not appear overnight. It was shaped by repeated crises and by individuals who noticed inconsistencies before others did. In classrooms, students learn about the Gilded Age, about robber barons, about westward expansion. They learn about dramatic strikes like the Pullman strike. They learn about presidents like Ulysses S. Grant and Cleveland. They rarely learn about Elias Whitmore. Yet his story represents a larger truth about American history. Transformation is cumulative.
When we examine the economic volatility of the late 19th century, we see a nation experimenting. Capitalism at massive scale was new, regulation was limited, transparency was inconsistent, mistakes were inevitable. But so was adaptation. The Panic of 1873 forced Americans to confront uncomfortable realities about speculation and debt. It revealed how interconnected global finance had already become, even in the 19th century. European markets influenced American railroads. Confidence traveled across oceans. Sound familiar? More than a century later, during the financial crisis of 2008, similar themes reappeared. Leveraged assets, speculative bubbles, systemic risk, and again, regulators searched historical precedents for guidance. They found many, because history preserved